We know that virtual coaching has become more competitive than ever. NASM's got you covered with our virtual coaching course. NASM's virtual coaching course provides a complete solution to help you translate your services into a successful virtual platform. This course will give you the tools to build and operate a sustainable virtual business model. The formats may be different, but you're still delivering fitness training and effective behavioral coaching. That doesn't change even if you can't be in the same physical space as your clients. The truth is, this is the way to reach more clients and expand your reach and impact. There's never been a better time to carve out your very own virtual space, and NASM is here to help. Welcome to NASM's virtual coaching.
You are listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Richey, the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. My name is Richey, and today I have Old Faithful. I have our Alex. We've got Scott Cheatham here today that's going to help to ensure that all of our personal trainers are doing what they need to do to protect themselves and others with insurance. So, Scott, welcome back on the show.
Yeah,
man.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
How did you and your background become so informed on the insurance side of things?
A good question. So first, my brother's a lawyer. So about 12 years ago, the state of California required laws and ethics for physical therapists. And so I actually have a continuing education company where my brother and I partnered up and we created a laws and ethics course. And at the same time, I started teaching laws and ethics at the university for kinesiology majors and health and fitness. So that kind of bridged me into the world of, laws and ethics. And then from there, I was approached by the Physical Therapy Board of California to be a practice expert for them. So I work for the Department of Consumer Affairs in California, where we help kind of prosecute people who break the law, who break the Practice Act. But also at the same time, I started being approached by different attorneys to be a legal expert witness. So kind of fast forward till now, part of my company and my consulting is the space of laws and ethics. And so I work for, the Board of California, but I also provide expert witness services for different health and fitness cases.
That is crazy interesting, and I definitely want to talk more about that. But before we get started, I just want to point out how proud your parents must be to have two kids with doctoral degrees. So, so let's get into talking about some of this. Now, as you know, Scott, and as a lot of the listeners may know, I own several gyms in New York City, and they are they're like co-working spaces. So I provide the gym, the equipment, the showers, the towels, all that stuff. I provide the space for them to work out in. And then the trainers rent space from me, and then they run their business out of it. And I require that they have insurance. And by the way, I've been gone from Alabama from a really long time, Scott. I grew up there. I was there for 21 years.
Whoa.
But you may notice that I don't really have an accent until I say the word insurance. And I'm going to say insurance probably more than insurance. So if you hear me say insurance, you know that Alabama is coming right back out of me. So I require these, what's called an accord form, but an accord form is just a standardized form that they use in New York and many other states. Probably, I think you said not in California, but it's a list of liability, right? So this is how much this is how much is aggregate. I don't know what that means. My people have to have me as a certificate holder on their insurance forms so that I'm covered and my business is covered by anything that happens with them. So I just want to know more about this because I require it and I still don't know what a lot of this stuff is or what it means. So talk me through some of it, and then I'm going to have some questions about, well, what if people are doing online training? What if people are training in their own homes? There's a lot of what ifs.
Yeah, so I think it's important for the viewers in the NASM family to understand that there's really two types of liability insurance. There's number one is professional liability insurance, and that's specific to the fitness professional. So professional liability insurance insures you as you're working one-on-one with the client. And I think that that's the first thing to remember. Now, for yourself, Rick, and myself too, if you own a facility, and there's a lot of owners among the NASM family, then you're going to have what's called general liability insurance. And that's typically like a slip and a fall, or maybe a piece of equipment breaks, or someone gets hurt on something that protects the premise. And in California, we call it premise liability. So in all 50 states, they have their own nomenclature and their own kind of terms and qualifications for professional liability and premise liability, or for the organization. Now, if we dig a bit deeper, we can see that throughout all of the NASM education certifications, we are trying to promote that that every fitness professional should do their due diligence and have professional liability insurance at minimum. Does that make sense? And I think that that's important because when it comes to at least in California or some of the other states that I've provided expert witness opinions on, they look at professional negligence as an act that departs from the standard of care of fitness professionals across the nation. Does that make sense? And I think that that's important because your professional liability insurance is meant to kind of, provide you with some financial protection if something happens and a client, hopefully an unfortunate event, if they decide to sue you for breaking the standard of care or having an act of negligence. So I think that that's an important aspect to the difference between professional liability and premise, or just, general liability that any business or organization would have.
All right. I've got a question about standard of care because let's be really honest about this, that people have different standards, and there are different schools of thought, and there are organizations that teach things differently than we do at NASM, and they're accredited. And you get that in your world in physical therapy, where there are physical therapists who will say, this spinal flexion, we want to be careful with that when you're lifting, when you keep nice straight spine. But then we've got some other physical therapists out there going, I think the Jefferson curl, these deadlifts where you roll your spine up, is actually really healthy for your spine. Now, suddenly that catches on and it catches fire, and a lot of people start doing it. Well, does that make it a new standard of care? Where do these standards come from, and when do you have these organizations that provide two different standards? For instance, I'm going to give you, for instance, I was a professional witness where I wrote in my testimony, my comments about the case. And there was a person that got injured, and they were claiming that the warm-up wasn't an appropriate warm-up. And there was no, what NASM likes to do, foam rolling and stretching and things like that. Well, this person was following another group's guidelines, and they were kind of dynamic exercises, and the warm-ups kind of looked like a workout, just, a lighter, more dynamic thing. And a woman ended up getting hurt. I try not to put my standard on them, where I said, I would foam roll, I would do some stretching, but I'd do maybe some dynamic stretching. It seems like that's what they did. There was some kind of dynamic warm up, but it's fitness, right? Like, it's exercise. Sometimes people just get hurt, right? I don't know where that comes in, and at what point do people get, based on different standards of care, are people actually liable for an injury that takes place? I don't know, pretty muddied water there, Scott. I don't know. I know you're like that. I wasn't on the questions list, Rick, but I am curious.
Okay, so I think let me try to address it in two parts. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we talk about standard of care for healthcare professionals, let's say physical therapists, chiropractors, etc. The standard of care is really determined by each state's practice act for the healthcare professional. So, like, for example, like in California, I, as a physical therapist, cannot order imaging or dry needling. And so if I decide to do, let's say, an orthopedic surgery in my garage on somebody, right, then all of a sudden I've deviated from the standard of care, right? So one thing is that, and I think it's important for the NASM family to realize, is that when a profession has state licensure, that sets the standard for the state. Okay. And so if a healthcare professional breaks the legal standard of care, then that's considered a criminal offense. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But also too, if a clinician, if a healthcare practitioner, causes some type of negligence, like, let's say, I'm on a case right now where a physical therapist created a 3rd-degree burn in someone's leg because they turned up the electrical stimulation too high. Okay.
Mm.
So I'm investigating that from the legal standpoint of breaking the law, but also there's a civil lawsuit, right?
Sure.
Departing from the standard of care. So there's two different levels. Now, as we move to fitness, that's why I think that there's a lot of organizations pushing for state licensure to regulate the fitness profession, because the standard of care, in my humble opinion, depends on each state when it comes to fitness. Does that make sense? So, for example, Rick, you've been in the industry for years, so I would consider you a practice expert in health and fitness in the state of New York. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, and so I think that's where it's kind of very open-ended right now in fitness, because you're right, is that we have certifications and we have the NCCA accreditation, which is a standard. But when we go beyond that, though, there's no states right now that have defined the practice of fitness. They haven't set up guardrails for people to stay in their lane. So that's the problem. So nationwide, when I opine or testify on fitness related cases that aren't criminal, that are more civil, they look at my CV, they look at my degrees, they look at all the certifications I have, and then based on the attorney, they determine if I'm a qualified expert in the state and nationwide to opine for either the defense or the plaintiff. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So yeah, so we have to remember right now, the sky's the limit with fitness training. You can make as much money as you want. You have a lot more freedom. I always joke with other fitness professionals and say, you know what, you guys have more power than I do as a physical therapist. Right? Because you guys can train people, you can do a lot of different things because there's really no major regulations. And so I think that's important, where we have, like the NASM code of conduct, right? And we have all these other accrediting bodies in fitness have very similar codes of conduct that we go by. So I've used several of those before in prior cases. So right now, as far as standard of care, in my opinion, just to kind of summarize it, it's going to be really up to the qualified professional, number one. And number two is it's going to be the state that you work in, because each state has different qualifications. Like, for example, in California about 5 years ago, the legislature very clearly noted that only registered dietitians can, can provide nutritional advice. So basically, if you're a fit pro in California, or even a physical therapist or whatever, chiropractor and stuff like that, you have to really be careful and really talk about more of the macros versus trying to cater and create this individualized program, because we're not qualified. So hopefully that answers your question on that.
Yeah. Have you seen or noticed, or are you in the know? Is there an increase or an uptick in litigation against fitness, or personal trainers, fitness facilities, things like that? I know as a facility owner, I have to be careful. I know the number one thing for any facility, I think worldwide, is slip and falls, right? So if there's water or there's something like that, that's like the biggest deal, making sure that slip and fall is done. Aside from slip and falls, are we seeing an uptick in clients holding trainers responsible for injuries that take place during sessions?
Yeah, I'm actually on one case right now, and there is an increase in multidisciplinary facilities. Okay, where there's especially, and a lot of cases I'm getting is coming out of actually Arizona, Nevada, California, along the West Coast. Okay. I've done some in New Mexico, but a lot of the cases that I run into are it's a combination of, let's say, like a physical therapy office that has fitness, strength and conditioning. Maybe they're connected to a CrossFit gym or whatever, So there's a lot of this interprofessional care. And the biggest mistake that I'm seeing when I look at the continuum of documentation and the total care of the client is that they get too busy. Is that these facilities are too busy. They're seeing too many people. So the physical therapist discharges this client to fitness. The fitness trainer doesn't have all the information. They train somebody and then they get injured. Does that make sense? And then the whole organization is sued. And then when you look at the totality of the communication, the documentation, it's not there. So the fitness professional may not have all the tools. And a lot of the ones that I've opined on or given opinion was that they're just too darn busy. There's too many clients. They're too busy, and they miss little things like reading a chart, Okay. Or communicating with the previous clinicians. So that's why I'm always promoting for fitness professionals to make sure that they schedule out their day where they have at least a half an hour in between clients, hopefully, so that they can rest, they can look at their notes, and they can plan accordingly and not be too rushed. And I know during the COVID, especially all of us in health and fitness, we got hit financially, but the biggest mistakes I've seen is people just get too busy and they just become in this clinical mode kind of per se, and they don't slow down and really clearly plan out their programming each day for their client and stick to their SMART goals and stick to their periodization schedule. That's what I'm seeing.
All right. I have another question, and then I want to get into kind of what we see on these insurance forms. But this is a question that's come up quite a bit actually in my time as a fitness professional, and it's a debate. And realize this is a legal debate that people are having in this profession versus an ethical debate, which is, should you write down your programs? Now, when you write down your programs, you have an outline of what you did. So if somebody gets hurt, you can say, well, what took place, and should somebody just in a regular standard of care, was that something that led to it? Was it not progressive leading up to kind of these, overuse injury, and that overuse injury might just be a one-time big lift, or it could be a lot of repetitive things, or not write anything down. And if you don't write anything down, then there's no proof that you did anything wrong. So I'm hearing this on both sides. I know ethically you need to write stuff down so that you can work people out. but I'm hearing it from people in really high places that it could be counter to you if you do write anything down. So explain that from a legal perspective first. Like, I know ethically, let's talk about writing it down, but does it hold water? And do you know, because I don't know if you do or not, if you write it down versus not writing it down, how much does that end up leading to you being pinned for something?
Okay, well, for healthcare professionals with licensure, documentation is mandatory in all 50 states. So that's right away. There is a paradigm shift, in my humble opinion, in fitness where they're considered healthcare professionals now. Okay, and we're seeing that come more and more in the nomenclature among people. And there's one rule of thumb that we use legally when we look at things. And these cases that I've opined on, there's been a lack of documentation. And so when they deposed these fitness professionals, the attorneys asked them, what happened, and their recall wasn't very good. So this one case I'm on, we easily won it because of the lack of poor documentation. So one rule of thumb is, number one is healthcare professionals are starting to become, at least in the cases that I've had, they're starting to be held to the standard of any type of healthcare practitioner as far as HIPAA and also documentation. So if you don't write it down, it never happened. And that's kind of one of the rules we go by. So at least in my world, I've never heard of, if you it's going to be to your advantage if you don't document something, because if you're seeing 8 or 10 patients a day, right, or eight or 10 clients as a fit pro, how in the heck are you going to remember everything, right? And so, I think it's important that you do provide that SOAP note or whatever documentation that you have so you can remember, but also that you have a working chart as a professional so that you can clearly document a patient's progress. You can update their goals. You can give yourself an idea. That's what the P is for, is plan, is be able to set yourself up for the next session. So I don't think that the lack of documentation is going to work for you, because our whole point is we're here to help people. So what does documentation have to do with your practice? The best way to prevent a adverse event is to make good decisions professionally, in my opinion.
Excellent. All right. That's important. And that what you said was also important. I think that's why people were saying, if you don't write it down, you'll be safer than if you do write it down, because they said exactly what you said, but just from a different perspective. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. But what you're saying is, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen, which means we can't prove that you provided good service, a progressive means to getting somebody to where they were, and that personal trainers now, even in these litigious examples, are being held to the same or similar standards as healthcare professionals. And for all intents and purposes, legally, personal trainers are not healthcare professionals. We believe that we are. We believe that we help people's health, and many other people help people's ailments. So we find ourselves to be healthcare professionals, but we're not seen that way by others. You're just saying, from a litigious point of view, it's starting to creep in that we are being held to the same standards.
Correct. And I think it's important to realize that in the cases I've opined with the plaintiff and with the defense on a couple of these interprofessional cases. And in my view, when I was with the plaintiff and stuff, the cases that I was on, the pendulum always shifts towards the plaintiff, because even though the fitness professional had a lack of documentation, and some leaders may perceive that that's better, they're certified, they're the professional, right? So irregardless of documentation or not, the attorney from the plaintiff and the standard of care says, well, wait a second, you're a fitness professional, you have whatever degrees of education, you're certified. So irregardless of your charting, you're the professional, and the the client was listening to you. So if you don't document, then it's really your word against the plaintiff, right? The defense against the plaintiff. But the pendulum will always go towards the plaintiff because they're paying you for a service, and you're the designated professional, and you have liability insurance. Does that make sense? So you and you may have your own company or whatever. So you've deemed yourself as a professional. The pendulum and the favor will always swing to the client or the plaintiff unless you can prove otherwise. And in my humble opinion, that's where the documentation will come in and say, hey, wait a second. No, I did not do that with the client. Here's what we did. And I've seen that in a couple cases where there's been some good documentation on the fitness from the fitness side and the physical therapy. And I said, you know what? I don't think they did anything wrong. So there's been a couple cases that I've had. So there's definitely different opinions on documentation, but in my opinion, I do fitness and physical therapy, and I document all the time. And I use like Google Docs, and I use just a lot of online stuff that's very fast, but I make sure I document with everyone every day. And yes, it's kind of a pain in the butt, but in my opinion, in the cases I've been on, I think it's to the advantage of everybody.
Nice. All right. So let me just share this real quick. Some of the things that I do. It's a great time to plug the NASM Edge app. So I'm going to plug that app. It's a great way to work with your clients and put in little clips and videos and schedule and program, and you have access to it. They have access to it. But also things that I've done is I put people in my schedule, and let's say I've got a Monday, Wednesday at 7 a.m. So I put Monday, Wednesday at 7 a.m. and I invite my client. So it's in their calendar. And then I can take notes in the notes section of the calendar. So that way my workout is in their calendar. So when they open up our calendar appointment and they see what time it is, we're going to be, 7 a.m. meeting me on Monday. And at the end of it, or before it starts, whenever it is, I've got an entire list of, any assessments that were done and what workouts took place during that. And then they have access to it too. Well, that's one of the great things about the NASM app also, is that they have access to it. All right, so let's talk about a couple of things. I want to go with, I mentioned early on, online personal training. This virtual training, we've had a huge uptick in virtual training. Do you need to have insurance to do that?
Yeah, in my opinion, you need to check with your carrier in your state just to make sure, because I have a policy out of California that it covers me for consulting services, and it's called an endorsement. It's basically an add-on to your standard, professional liability insurance, and it allows me to consult either teaching, phone, electronic, email. It covers all that. So I encourage everybody who has a standard policy, like NASM uses Next Insurance. They're great. I love them. Really great company. But in your state, everything's a little bit different because California has different qualifiers when it comes to liability insurance and what they can offer. So I encourage you to talk to your insurance agent or the company in your state and see if they can do an add-on or what's called an endorsement that gives you that coverage under the policy. Or if they do it, see if they can do it in writing, because ever since the COVID, the last 8 months, most states have approved telemedicine, right? And so again, telemedicine is just a broad term. So I've been doing telemedicine ever since the onset of the COVID, right? Where we do it by phone, but I have to chart everything just like it's a real patient. So there's really, if you, in my opinion, if you're giving professional advice, if you're providing an opinion, that is professional, right? That's professional. Sure. And you are set to a higher standard. Okay. So anytime you give professional advice, in my opinion, that's where your professional liability insurance will cover you. And so even though it's electronic or live or via email, everything you do is defensible, and it's also admissible, right? So I think it's important for everybody, and again, as I'm repeating this, but everyone in their state, you got to check with your state and what they require, and also your insurance company, because I think more and more insurance companies are starting to add that endorsement to the general policy. You may have to pay a little bit more, but I think a lot of us in the fitness industry, like my gym shuttered in California, it's gone, right? The one I was working out on. So I'm having to do a lot of other stuff. I'm having to go to people's homes and all that. So my whole, and I'm sure Rick, with you, with all this with the second spike, you're looking at ways to try to be inventive and stuff. So a lot of fit pros are going online. So we need to protect ourselves either way. And again, that's where it's a cluster of protections, right? Good decision making, charting what you do, right? And also making sure that you have the legal protection or the financial protection with the liability policy for online personal training.
Gotcha. All right. So this is really good to know. And I don't personally do any of that, but I'm sure people ask me questions and I give them my opinion. So, so I need to make sure that I have that as part of what I do. All right. So let's talk about what that means, because I know when I get these accord forms from people, it'll be a general liability, but then there'll be a sub portion of it that will have a box checked off that will say professional liability. And there are all sorts of numbers. There are this word aggregate, and there are, damage to the premises. There are all these kind of subdivisions that take place on a policy. Are you familiar with just policies in general and what they generally have and what we need to be sure, if that liability part isn't ticked off under the general, then I'm sure that we need to ensure that is indeed checked off. And then my other question, just to follow up on that, a lot of times personal trainers are covered by their gym if they're an employee. So if they're an employee of a corporate gym, then they're covered by their insurance. Do you think that those trainers that are just working for the company need to, in fact, get their own liability or their own insurance just in case?
Two great questions. So let's kind of break down the first one. I think it's important to understand, at least in my lens, a lot of, when you sign up for professional liability insurance, these companies use the term protect yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that term can sometimes be, can almost be like a misnomer when it comes to insurance, or there's some confusion with it, because the liability insurance covers you financially if you are sued by somebody. And I think that that's important to understand. It doesn't protect you. The biggest protection for any professional is to have good clinical or good gym decision making, right? You have to have good decision making, and that's what protects you the most. Now, if an unfortunate event occurs and you do suffer a lawsuit, the insurance policy that you have, if it's professional liability insurance, will cover your legal expenses. Okay, and I think that that's important. And so the standard across all 50 states that I've seen is where it says 1 million per occurrence, and 3 million aggregate, which is the total amount of the policy. Okay. So let's say, for example, if you're a fitness professional and you're doing a group fitness class and you're doing HIIT training, and let's say, for example, you're doing some group stuff, and a couple members, let's say, unfortunately got injured or something, and there's a lawsuit or something like that. Well, that policy has different sub-classifications, and they have dollar amounts that start with the 1 million per occurrence, and then it itemizes every little occurrence that it will be covered under that $1 million per occurrence umbrella. Do we understand that? Okay, so most policies, again, and I'll kind of repeat this, is 1 million per occurrence. And if you look at your policy closely, it'll itemize all the actions, let's say, all the negative actions, or all the all the legal issues that it'll cover. It'll cover your legal expenses. If unfortunately there is a miscommunication and there's a sexual misconduct, it'll cover injuries. It'll cover this. So it'll automatically go down and give you the dollar amount that's covered, and that will add up to the $1 million per occurrence. The total policy is $3 million per aggregate. Now that's standard. That's a standard policy that I've seen throughout the states and all the cases that I've been on, and also all the insurance carriers. Now, obviously, if you're looking at strictly professional liability insurance, you can obviously pay more money and have a bigger policy. Or you can add on what's called endorsements. Like, so for example, the policy that I have in California is for fitness and physical therapy, but also consulting, because when I'm working with the PT Board of California, I could still be sued by a defendant. Does that make sense? So I have a personal policy that covers consulting. Also, too, now physical therapy. We're working on animals, so now I have an endorsement for animal physical therapy. I know it gets crazy, right? But the thing is my policy in California doesn't cover plastic surgery, so I can't do it anymore in my garage. No,
sorry to hear that.
I know. I was kidding. I'm just teasing. But yeah, so again, you have your standard $1 million per incident, $3 million aggregate. Each state has their own regulations on the itemization of that $1 million. And then from there, depending on what you do professionally, then you would talk to your insurance carrier and say, hey, look, I would like an extra add-on or an endorsement for, let's say, online personal training, for group here, or I'm going to do this. Or for you, you're looking at, we call it more of an add-on, but if I'm going to be a subcontractor, let's say in your facility, Rick, okay, which would be a dream, by the way, because you're the man. And if I was going to go to New York and do some stuff with Rick, then I would create an add-on policy, we call it in California, that I would name you as the premise.
Yes.
So then that would help. That would be another layer of protection for you as the owner of the business organization. So that's kind of a general breakdown of different policies. And again, each state and each insurance carrier has their own descriptive kind of evidence of insurance that they'll have, but those are kind of the basic nuts and bolts of that.
Okay. And you're right about that. If I have somebody that's coming to train out of my facility, they are required to have insurance, at least $1 million of general liability insurance, where I am listed on their policy. So I'm covered by their insurance. All right. So I want to ask this question. I know you've probably been asked it before, Scott, but it's about if you are a sole proprietor versus an LLC. How would an LLC help you, or would it help you? Should it be a consideration for people that are out there? The LLC itself means limited liability corporation. How does that limit liability? And is that something that personal trainers should indeed consider?
Okay, so I think that again is another great question. Now, if we look at big picture, is we talk about incorporating, creating a corporation, okay? And there's, and in each state, again, each state is different because they're all kind of their own little tribes. But let's say, for example, like in California or, in Nevada or in New York or whatever, you can have typically, in general, 3 different corporate structures. You can have an LLC, which is limited liability. That, in my opinion, at least this is what I teach, is that when you have an LLC, it's really good if you have like partners where, let's say, for example, you're going to be responsible for 50% of the business, the other person is 2. So that's where they say it's a limited liability. That's one way to look at LLCs, or you can just form it yourself depending on your state tax code, depending on your accountant, etc. Okay. But then you also have what's called an S Corp and a C Corp. So you have different corporate structures that take you from being a sole proprietor to a individual corporate entity. Now, the advantage of incorporating is that you protect your personal assets. Okay, so that means that if an unfortunate incident occurs and you happen to get sued by a client, they will sue the corporation and not go after your house and your boat and your car and your jet skis and your snow skis and no, I'm kidding, right? So they're not gonna go after everything. So the advantage of a fitness professional incorporating is, number one, is the corporate legal protections.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is that if you design your corporation properly, you can have different advantages as far as corporate write-offs, like uniforms. You can write off equipment. You can write off travel time and stuff like that. So in each state, they have their own, obviously, tax codes and in-state insurance. In California, man, we're reamed. We pay 10% sales tax. So we have the highest tax in the United States. So I had to incorporate because number one is I'm going to protect my home and all my assets. But number two is I have better tax advantages being a corporation, right? Rather than being an independent contractor where I can't write off all the basic expenses of stuff. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's twofold, but I think as we're talking about liability insurance and professional, I think that that most fitness professionals should check into being incorporated because you get the tax benefits, but you also protect yourself. Okay. And I think that that's important, but in each state, you have to pay to play. So for example, I have to pay $800 a year just to keep my corporation live in California. Yeah. As well as all the other stuff. So it can be expensive, but in the industry, there is a sense of vulnerability that independent contractors have when it comes to legal cases and stuff, because the person can sue them directly and they can go after their personal assets versus having that corporate shell of protection. So
yeah, man, I find this fascinating. I know that there will be some listeners that are like, what are we talking about? This, give me fitness. But this, to me, is fascinating. I think it's because of the business component of it in fitness, which I'm super interested in and deeply embedded in. But it's also conversations that we don't have a lot. So people have these questions. It's like talking to a fitness accountant. We had Shannon Weinstein on not too long ago, and she was talking about accounting, and I thought it was such a valuable conversation that we had. So, and some people don't care. They don't want to hear about accounting, but for me, it's fascinating. This stuff is really interesting, and so I always want to learn a little bit more about it. What I want to do now, because I think we covered a lot of things that we intended on talking about, and we kind of hit them from different directions. So let's just go to Greg now. And Greg, our producer, is following the Facebook feed. So we're doing this Facebook Live. And so, Greg, do we have anybody talking about what's going on with the insurance? Oh, can you hear him, Scott?
No, not yet.
Okay.
It helps when you're not muted.
There he is.
Gentlemen, good to see you. And now good for you to hear me as well.
Yeah.
Mike in the chat wants to know, how would you approach training bodybuilders who are training with national practices that may be out of the norm? Are there liabilities for contest prep? And how do you protect yourself for them? Is there anything different you have to do in that kind of a case?
Well, I mean, in my humble opinion, I think right now with the whole fitness, industry, it's really going to be on an individual basis. So if I was going to, opine on a case that had to do with bodybuilding, I would have to consult other, professional bodybuilders or, high profile trainers for bodybuilders to see if that practice was the norm. Okay. So I understand where, one of our families coming from is, the dietary practices, the extreme training practices and stuff, that's very prevalent. And it's also prevalent like in CrossFit, right? All these extreme trainings. So it's really, at this point, there really isn't any case law in the United States that have set precedents for a standard in fitness when it comes to bodybuilding, HIIT training, the sport of CrossFit, etc. We're still open territory, and that's why a lot of the states are looking to regulate. So that's hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah. Can I just point out also, there was some really interesting things going on with regulation, and there were states that were trying to get this pushed through, and companies like IHRSA and NASM, as a part of that, were trying to figure out, well, how do we keep the states from doing the regulation? Within the industry, we can kind of regulate ourselves. And that's actually how the accreditation process took place. There was no third-party accreditation. I think it was 10 years ago, maybe, that switch started to take place. And it was a very large, expensive process. And these regulations did start to take place where the providers themselves had to come together and say, we need to make a decision within ourselves as education providers within the fitness industry to make a decision. So IHRSA was kind of the non-governmental governing agency of this process. And they still in many, many ways are. And NASM consults with what's going on in the industry. And we all kind of figure out, well, how do we get this information to kind of as well as we can match across the boards? Well, it's interesting because they do that nationally, but it's also interesting that when people want to do what's called a licensure, so they want to create a licensure or registration for professionals in each state can be different, as you've pointed out multiple times. So, we're trying to get this kind of national agreement between all of the providers of fitness education that this is a standard that we adhere to. And that's where that third-party accreditation comes in. Whether that changes in the future, I don't know. There always seems to be some legislature in some states, Maryland in particular. I think it's Maryland who's tried to propose this multiple times. But we'll see what happens. And, we'll take it as it comes. But as it currently stands, this is where the accreditation process actually started and took hold, is so that we can start to standardize some things across the board. But with that said, let's move on to any other questions that we might have. Greg, what else you got?
Yeah, Austin wants to know, have you found any increase in liability suits for online-only training since COVID started?
No, I have not. I have not heard anything yet as far as the cases that I've seen. I know right now in California, there's some of the bigger chain gyms where there's class action lawsuits because there were COVID breakouts in the gym. I know that there's a couple lawsuits right now in California for the big box gyms, the big chains, but nothing yet that has come through that a fitness professional has committed some type of negligent act. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's scary to me. All right, Greg. Thank you, Austin. Greg, what else you got?
Well, we've got plenty of questions.
Wow.
Allison wants to know, what does a liability waiver that clients sign come in? Where does that come into play here? An attorney recommended just finding a good one online and said insurance was more important than a waiver. Do you have any recommendations on that, Scott?
Yes. So one thing I think that's important is, as I mentioned before, each state has their own language. So when I write up my expert affidavit, let's say I have a case like in New Mexico right now versus California versus Nevada, Arizona, New York, whatever, you have to use the language that the state uses. And so I don't recommend getting something online and just using it, because you don't know if that's going to legally protect you. Because as you know, with law, certain words mean certain things. And so luckily I have a brother who's an attorney who helped me with mine specifically for California. So if there's, and doing, legal Zoom, right? Not Zoom, the platform, but legal Zoom or any other type of, cut and paste waivers. I believe is not the best. And I think that everybody, or maybe even a group of trainers that we know in a state, can pay, a few $100 to have an attorney look through their liability waivers. Now, in my opinion, and what I've seen when it comes to healthcare or fitness, when a client signs the liability waiver and they sign their history forms, that's their way of providing consent. Okay. So remember, consent you need to have client consent written and verbally, right? And anytime you start changing a exercise program, or let's say, for example, you want to use mechanical percussion on somebody, or you're doing something like KT tape, whatever you're trying to do, you always want to, after that initial written consent, you need to have verbal consent, and you need to chart it. You need to say, patient consented to treatment, or patient consented to this new exercise or whatever, and they tolerated it with no adverse events. So if you have that in your notes, you're at least showing that that you're creating, or you're producing client-centered programming. And I think that that's important. And so the liability waiver is one more added protection for you, which provides the foundation on top of your liability insurance. Okay. And so I think that those are important to have, especially like the PAR-Q and also the history form. You need to make sure that you have those intact with every client, and that every year annually, in my humble opinion, you renew them. Okay, so when you see a client, or if some of you, we have some dual credential people in the family, if you guys see somebody as a patient or as a client, then you need to renew the forms every so often and redo their history. And that's doing our due diligence, just like taking blood pressure and your physiological assessments on a regular basis. So that's kind of my answer to that.
Great. And then we have one final one from Ryan, who wants to know, when posting or emailing complimentary content, workouts, guidelines, etc., would you advise adding a general disclaimer to that, just to protect yourself?
Yes, I think it's important. I do this too, that if you're providing like a complimentary workout, you're saying, one of the key words is, and this is what my brother had told me, is that this information is for educational purposes only. Okay. Prior to beginning an exercise program, please consult with a qualified healthcare practitioner. Okay, so some type of statement like that, and some type of general statement is understandable, and that's going to help protect you, because then if something adverse does happen, you can say, wait a second, it was communicated to the client in the email. Because remember, social media, email, also texting are all admissible now. Okay, most states changed laws or created regulations that allow that to be admissible in court. So I've looked at social media. I've had transcripts from texts and stuff. So again, as people serving the general public, we have to be careful with what we write and what we say, always. And so we have to remember that complimentary workouts are great, but you need to have a proper disclaimer. And you also need to make sure that if you text it to a client, or you email it, or you put it on social media, that you clearly state, hey, look, these are just some general guidelines. Please make sure that if you have any pain or discomfort, or you have a pre-existing injury, please get cleared by a qualified healthcare practitioner. And then that keeps you in your scope of practice. Okay, and that to me, that's the biggest way to prevent lawsuits, is to stay in your lane and have good decision making.
All right, I think such a great statement. Good decision making is better than anything else. But insurance is, in fact, what we're trying to look at, which is the same thing. Like, good decision making behind the wheel of a car is very important. That's the most important thing. But you should still have insurance. With that said, I want to let people know, you may not know, you could go to Next Insurance and see if Next is available in your state. It is not in New York. So I've sent many people the NASM link to Next Insurance, and they're like, it's not working, and they don't accept it. So there are other insurance companies that do accept, that do work in states. So you may have to just see what that looks like and work with the companies that are in your state. You can't work with companies that aren't qualified in your state. Now, with that said, you can get about $1 million worth of coverage, general liability insurance, which can also then, and ensure that it does, include professional insurance as well. And now we also want to look at probably now the consulting insurance that as an add-on if you're doing online training. Now, I don't know what that add-on looks like, but I do know if you get the liability insurance, and that's general and professional, it generally for fitness professionals will cost less than $200 for the year, up to $1 million. And $2 million doesn't cost that much more, maybe 30, 40, 50 bucks, another $1 million. So it's not that expensive. Several sessions out of your training will cover the cost of being insured for well over $1 million. I think it's a good investment. It's something that you should truthfully and sincerely consider. And I believe that you should consider that even if you work in a large corporate gym, because at some point somebody's going to say, oh, hey, can you give me a workout? Can we work out at this gym, or can we go do a workout in the park? And you say yes. And now you've left the umbrella of your corporate facility and you're working on your own. And so, safety first, take care of yourself, protect yourself at all times. That they say in fight sports, protect yourself at all times. So insurance is vitally important to help you do that. Dr. Scott Cheatham, it's been a pleasure, man. Thank you for being on.
Thanks. Yeah. All
right. Any final words as we close this out?
Yeah, I think just in summary, I think it's important for the NASM family to really kind of make sure that we understand the two types of insurance where professional liability protects the professional, right? Mm-hmm. Then general liability protects the organization that you may own or that you work at. So for example, Dr. Richey's facility, his gym, if I was an independent contractor, I need to protect myself, but I also need to have a general policy. Yep. And I name his facility as an independent contractor to protect the premise. So I encourage everybody who are independent contractors or they're freelancers and they work in different facilities, please make sure that you communicate to the owner and say, okay, what do you need? Because again, it's different in every single state. But as we discussed today, big picture, liability insurance is one piece of a big puzzle. And we understand that best practices as being a fitness professional includes multiple things like documentation. It includes having liability insurance, but also good decision making. So, liability insurance is part of a huge part of the art of successful fitness training. And so I think everyone needs to kind of keep that in mind, that it's not just one isolated topic. There's a lot of interdependent topics that come with, being your own per se corporation,
Very good. All right. Dr. Scott Cheatham, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. If somebody wants to reach out to you to be a expert witness, how do people get in touch with you? How do they find you?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is, like I always mention, I'm old school. So drscottwcheatham.com is my portfolio website, or they can reach me social media. I'm in the NASM-CPT Facebook group. I'm always kind of presenting there. Or they can reach me at scheatham@csudh.edu. That's my university email.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you to everybody that tuned in, that followed this live and asked questions. We appreciate you being a part of it, and we hope that everyone found this beneficial. My name is Rick Richey. You can reach me at rick.richey, R-I-C-H-E-Y, at nasm.org. You can hit me up on Instagram at dr.rickrichey. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the NASM-CPT Podcast.